May 1945. High in the Bavarian Alps at 1,1834 meters elevation near Berchtesgaden. The Berghof stands silent. Hitler's mountain retreat, once the nerve center of Nazi decision-making, lies abandoned. The surrounding Obersalzberg complex sprawls across 2.7 kilometers of alpine terrain, its buildings empty, its tunnels echoing. American soldiers from the 3rd Infantry Division and the French 2nd Armored Division arrive on May 4, 1945, finding not a pristine command center, but a charred ruin. RAF Bomber Command had struck the complex just 5 days earlier, on April 25, dropping 1,232 tons of bombs in a devastating raid that left much of the infrastructure ablaze. Yet beneath the smoke and rubble lies something the Allies had not fully anticipated: a labyrinth of bunkers, tunnel systems extending over 4 kilometers, and buildings that had hosted the most consequential decisions of the Third Reich. What followed was not merely occupation, but a systematic process of exploitation, destruction, and ultimately erasure that would span decades. The scale of what the Allies discovered was staggering. The Obersalzberg had been transformed from a simple alpine village into a fortified compound that cost an estimated 150 million Reichsmarks to develop. At its peak, the complex housed not just the Berghof itself, but Martin Bormann's house, Hermann Göring's residence, SS barracks, administrative buildings, a kindergarten, farm buildings, and the famous Kahlstein House, or Eagle's Nest, perched even higher at 1,834 meters. The Americans found that whilst the April 25th bombing had destroyed or severely damaged approximately 60% of the surface structures, the underground facilities remained largely intact. These bunkers contained everything from furniture and artwork looted from across Europe to filing cabinets filled with documents, wine cellars stocked with thousands of bottles, and garages housing several Mercedes motor cars. The Berghof itself, though heavily damaged, still retained portions of its distinctive architecture. The famous Great Hall with its retractable window, Hitler's study, guest quarters, and the terrace where countless photographs had been taken. The condition varied dramatically. Some buildings were completely gutted by fire. Others stood relatively intact, but for shattered windows and collapsed roofs. The immediate challenge facing Allied commanders was logistical and political, rather than military. The complex sat in what would become the American zone of occupation, but its symbolic importance demanded careful handling. General Eisenhower himself ordered that the site be secured and preserved as evidence for potential war crimes trials. Within days of arrival, American troops from the 101st Airborne Division established security perimeters around the entire Obersalzberg area. Their first priority was documenting everything. Military intelligence officers, accompanied by photographers and archivists, began systematic cataloging. The Counterintelligence Corps seized 485 boxes of documents from various buildings, including correspondence, architectural plans, and administrative records. Art specialists from the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program identified stolen artworks, though most valuable pieces had already been evacuated by the SS in the final weeks of the war. The Americans also discovered the extent of Hitler's personal effects: clothing, books from his library, furniture from the Berghof, and even his telephone equipment. American operations at the Berghof were driven by two competing impulses: preserve as evidence and prevent the site becoming a shrine. The U.S. Army established the Berchtesgaden Rest Center in June 1945, converting several undamaged buildings, including the Platterhof Hotel and portions of the SS barracks, into recreation facilities for American soldiers. Between June 1945 and 1952, an estimated 40,000 American servicemen visited the area, most touring the damaged Berghof as part of their leave. Officers established strict rules about souvenir hunting, yet enforcement proved impossible. Soldiers systematically stripped the complex, taking everything from door handles and light fixtures to chunks of marble and wood paneling. Estimates suggest that thousands of individual items were removed during this period, scattered across America in attics and basements. Meanwhile, Military intelligence conducted detailed interviews with captured staff members, including Herbert Göring, the Berghof's house administrator, and Anna Winter, one of Hitler's housekeepers, to understand the complex's layout and Hitler's daily routines. Technical teams surveyed the bunker systems, producing detailed maps that revealed the sophistication of the underground network, which included ventilation systems, power generation facilities, and even an underground telephone exchange connecting to Berlin. The U.S. Army also faced a preservation dilemma. By late 1945, engineers assessed that the Berghof's damaged structure was deteriorating rapidly. Winter weather and ongoing souvenir hunting accelerated collapse. In November 1945, Army Corps of Engineers recommended either complete restoration at enormous cost or controlled demolition. Washington chose neither immediately, instead opting for minimal stabilization, whilst officials debated the site's future. This indecision proved costly as local Bavarians began unofficially salvaging materials for reconstruction of their own war-damaged homes, particularly bricks, timber, and metal fittings. British involvement with the Berghof was limited but diplomatically significant. In July 1945, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery visited the ruins during a tour of the American zone, accompanied by American commanders. British intelligence officers examined documents that American teams had catalogued, particularly those relating to German strategic planning. The British were less interested in the physical complex than in its archival contents. Teams from the British Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee interviewed German personnel who had worked at the Obersalzberg, focusing on understanding Hitler's decision-making processes, rather than the infrastructure itself. Unlike the Americans who maintained continuous presence at the site, British involvement was intermittent and research-focused. Several British journalists and historians visited between 1945 and 1947, producing accounts that would shape early English-language histories of the Third Reich. The British perspective generally favored complete demolition, arguing that preservation risked creating a Nazi pilgrimage site, a view they communicated through diplomatic channels, but without direct authority to enforce. Soviet interest in the Berghof was intense, but geographically constrained. The complex lay in the American zone, denying the Soviets direct access, which frustrated Moscow considerably. Soviet intelligence operatives attempted to visit under various pretexts throughout 1945 and 1946, seeking information about Hitler's final months and potential intelligence the Americans might have overlooked. NKVD officers interviewed German prisoners who had worked at the Berghof, cross-referencing their testimonies with American public statements. The Soviets were particularly interested in documents relating to Hitler's relationship with industrialists and any evidence of separate peace negotiations between Western powers and Nazi officials. When denied access to original documents, Soviet representatives demanded copies through official channels, receiving selectively edited materials that satisfied protocol without revealing sensitive intelligence. The Soviet approach emphasized what they could not obtain, leading to decades of theories in Soviet historiography about what the Americans had discovered and concealed. Stalin himself reportedly requested detailed reports on the Berghof's fate, viewing its destruction or preservation as symbolically important for post-war narratives about defeating fascism. The question of what to do with the Berghof reached its conclusion through Bavarian initiative rather than Allied directive. By 1952, the American military had withdrawn from the rest center, turning the site over to Bavarian state authorities. Local officials faced immediate problems. The ruins attracted neo-Nazis, tourists, and souvenir hunters in roughly equal measure. The Bavarian government concluded that partial preservation was untenable and expensive. On April 30, 1952, exactly 7 years after Hitler's suicide, Bavarian authorities detonated the Berghof's remaining structures. Engineers used 2,700 kilograms of explosives to collapse walls, chimneys, and the iconic Great Hall window frame. The demolition was thorough but not complete. Foundation walls and basement levels proved too robust for surface explosives. Over subsequent months, contractors removed approximately 85% of the rubble, salvaging metal for scrap and crushing concrete. The site was then bulldozed and covered with soil and vegetation in an attempt to erase visible traces. Other buildings met similar fates between 1952 and 1956. Bormann's house was demolished in 1954, and portions of the SS barracks were dismantled for materials. Only the Kelstein house, positioned separately and structurally sound, was preserved, reopened as a restaurant and tourist destination in 1952. Its Nazi associations downplayed in favor of its architectural and scenic value. The demolition was not universally supported. Some historians argued for preservation as a museum documenting Nazi crimes, whilst others feared it would become a shrine. The Bavarian government prioritized preventing neo-Nazi gatherings over historical preservation, a decision reflecting the immediate political climate of 1950s West Germany, where denazification was giving way to reconstruction and reconciliation. Economic factors also mattered. Bavaria needed building materials, and the Obersalzberg's ruins represented valuable salvage during a period of severe shortages. Preservation of the Berghof complex was minimal and fragmented. The Kelstein house survived as the only intact building, today receiving approximately 300,000 visitors annually. Small sections of the bunker system were preserved, later opened as the Documentation Obersalzberg Museum in 1999, which occupies part of the former bunker network. This museum presents historical exhibits about Nazi ideology and crimes, deliberately avoiding glorification of the Berghof itself. Only foundation remnants and portions of the basement remained after demolition, now overgrown and inaccessible to the public, deliberately left unmarked to discourage pilgrimage. Items removed from the complex are scattered globally. The Deutsches Historisches Museum in Berlin holds several pieces of furniture definitively provenant to the Berghof. The National Archives and Records Administration in College Park, Maryland, preserves 383 boxes of documents seized from the Obersalzberg. Private collections, particularly in the United States, contain thousands of items, from silverware bearing the Berghof monogram to architectural fragments. Though provenance is often disputed, museums face ethical dilemmas about displaying these items, balancing historical education against concerns about fetishizing Nazi memorabilia. The Imperial War Museum in London holds photographs and documents related to the complex, but no significant physical artifacts. Restoration of what little survives has been deliberately minimal. Bavaria's policy is to acknowledge the site's existence without highlighting it, maintaining informational signage whilst discouraging tourism focused on Nazi history. The Berghof's legacy shaped post-war approaches to dealing with Nazi architecture. Destruction established precedent for eliminating structures too symbolically powerful to preserve neutrally. The complex influenced Cold War dynamics minimally, lacking the technological or strategic value of captured German weapons or research. However, it played an outsized role in popular culture, appearing in countless documentaries, books, and films, often depicting the intact Berghof rather than its ruined reality. Ethically, the site represents unresolved questions about how societies remember dictatorship. Modern historians generally support the demolition decision, arguing that 1950s Bavaria lacked the interpretive frameworks necessary for responsible preservation. Today's Documentation Obersalzberg represents evolved thinking, direct engagement with difficult history through education rather than erasure or preservation. The museum receives approximately 180,000 visitors annually, many unaware that the Berghof itself once stood just meters away. Archaeological work continues to reveal buried portions of the complex, though excavation is carefully controlled. In 2006, workers discovered additional bunker sections during construction, subsequently documented and resealed. The American occupation phase from 1945 to 1952 revealed competing institutional priorities. The U.S. military simultaneously wanted to preserve evidence, while preventing Nazi mythology from taking root. The Berchtesgaden Rest Center served practical purposes, providing recreation for exhausted troops, whilst inadvertently facilitating the complex's gradual dismantlement through souvenir hunting. Military police reports from 1946 document confiscating truckloads of stolen items from departing soldiers, yet acknowledge that enforcement remained sporadic at best. The sheer volume of visitors, combined with the site's isolated alpine location, made comprehensive security impossible. This unofficial looting achieved what official policy hesitated to accomplish: the systematic removal of the Berghof's contents, dispersing them so thoroughly that reconstruction became impossible. Intelligence operations at the site prioritized documentary evidence over physical preservation. American and British teams photographed, catalogued, and removed anything potentially relevant to war crimes prosecutions or understanding Nazi decision-making. The Counterintelligence Corps established a dedicated facility at the Platterhof Hotel where analysts processed seized documents. German-speaking officers interviewed local residents who had worked at the Obersalzberg, creating detailed testimonies about the complex's operations. These interviews revealed mundane details: food deliveries, construction schedules, staff hierarchies that humanized the site whilst simultaneously documenting its role in genocide planning. The intelligence gathered shaped Nuremberg prosecutions, though the Berghof itself received surprisingly little attention during the trials. Prosecutors focused on documentary evidence of crimes rather than the locations where decisions were made. The complex's symbolic importance in Nazi mythology interested historians more than prosecutors. The Bavarian government's demolition decision in 1952 reflected specifically German concerns about Nazi resurgence. Unlike Allied forces who could eventually leave, Bavarian authorities would permanently remain responsible for managing whatever survived. Reports from 1950 and 1951 documented increasing neo-Nazi activity at the ruins, including unauthorized ceremonies on Hitler's birthday and attempts to recover artifacts. State police lacked resources for continuous surveillance of the remote site. Demolition offered a permanent solution to an ongoing security problem. The engineering challenges proved more complex than anticipated. Initial assessments suggested that conventional explosives would suffice, but the Berghof's construction had been extraordinarily robust. Hitler had demanded bomb-proof facilities, and engineers had delivered. Foundation walls exceeded 1 meter thickness in places, reinforced with steel that survived the April 1945 bombing largely intact. The 2,700 kilograms of explosives used in April 1952 demolished above-ground structures effectively, but subsurface elements resisted. Contractors spent months using jackhammers and cutting torches to reduce foundations to manageable rubble. The work proceeded deliberately out of public view. Bavarian authorities wanted the Berghof to disappear quietly, without media spectacle that might attract attention. News coverage of the demolition remained minimal, primarily local newspapers noting the work without extensive commentary. This contrasted sharply with later demolitions of Nazi structures, which by the 1960s had become public ceremonies explicitly rejecting Nazi ideology. The 1950s approach emphasized forgetting rather than confronting. Material salvage from demolition proved economically significant. Bavaria in 1952 still faced reconstruction challenges, with building materials in short supply. Steel reinforcement bars were carefully extracted and sold to construction firms. Usable bricks were cleaned and redistributed. Even broken concrete was crushed for aggregate. The salvage operation generated revenue that partially offset demolition costs whilst serving the practical purpose of rebuilding Bavaria. This economic pragmatism received little discussion at the time. Later generations would question whether profit from Nazi structures was ethically appropriate, but 1950s Bavaria prioritized reconstruction over symbolism. The Kelstein house survived demolition through geographical separation and structural integrity. Located several kilometers from the main Obersalzberg complex and accessible only by a specific mountain road, it presented different management challenges. Its distinctive architecture and dramatic alpine setting possessed obvious tourist appeal divorced from Nazi associations. Bavarian authorities calculated that preserving the Kelstein House as a restaurant would generate revenue whilst its remote location limited pilgrimages. The building's Nazi history was acknowledged but minimized. Informational materials emphasized the construction achievement and mountain views rather than Hitler's visits. This approach proved commercially successful, with the Kelstein House becoming a major tourist attraction, generating substantial income for the region. However, critics argued that downplaying Nazi connections risked sanitizing history. The tension between tourism revenue and historical responsibility would persist for decades. The Dokumentation Obersalzberg Museum, opened in 1999, represented a fundamental shift in approach. By the late 1990s, German society had developed greater capacity for confronting Nazi history directly. The museum deliberately occupies portions of the former bunker system, forcing visitors into physical spaces where Nazi decisions were made. Exhibits emphasize Nazi crimes, the machinery of dictatorship, and local complicity rather than Hitler's biography or lifestyle. The museum's existence acknowledges that erasure failed. Despite demolition and burial, the Berghof remained powerful in memory and mythology. Education rather than destruction became the chosen strategy. This reflected broader evolution in German historical consciousness, from the 1950s emphasis on moving forward to contemporary insistence on remembering clearly. The museum receives visitors who arrive specifically seeking Nazi history, but confronts them with historical complexity rather than simplified narratives. Architectural remnants visible from the museum, foundation walls, bunker entrances are presented as evidence of crimes rather than nostalgic artifacts. The long-term fate of the Berghof demonstrates how societies struggle with architectural legacies of dictatorship. Complete erasure proved impossible. Despite determined efforts, the site's location remains known, its history documented extensively, and its absence speaks as loudly as preservation might have. The choice between demolition and preservation represented a false binary. The Berghof persists in photographs, films, books, and memory regardless of physical destruction. What changed was the framework for engagement. The 1950s chose erasure, hoping the site would be forgotten. Contemporary Germany chooses education, hoping the site teaches, hoping the site teaches. Neither approach fully succeeds, but education at least confronts rather than avoids. International comparisons reveal varying approaches to similar challenges. The Soviet Union preserved some Nazi sites as museums emphasizing Soviet liberation. Poland maintained Auschwitz as evidence of genocide. Austria struggled with its own Nazi architectural heritage, often choosing neglect over active decision-making. The Berghof's demolition influenced these discussions, establishing that removal was possible, though perhaps not desirable. Each nation's choices reflected specific historical circumstances, political pressures, and cultural capacities for confronting difficult pasts. May 1945 brought American soldiers to a burning ruin high in the Alps, beginning a decades-long process that transformed Hitler's symbol of power into an absence, a gap in the landscape more eloquent than any monument. Of the 2.7 kilometers that once housed the Third Reich's mountain headquarters, almost nothing remains visible today. The systematic stripping, demolition, and burial achieved what Allied bombs had begun: the erasure of the Berghof from physical reality, whilst ensuring its persistence in historical memory. It stands as testament to how quickly even the most fortified symbols can vanish when societies choose to forget, and how completely they persist when societies choose to remember. The Berghof exists today primarily as educated absence, marked by a museum that explains what is not there rather than celebrates what was.